Imagine being told by every civilization that ever knew you that you no longer deserve to exist. That was the day humanity stopped being a member of the galaxy and started becoming its future. The Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council had never been so silent. 1,000 delegates from 400 worlds sat frozen in their seats, watching a single species stand alone at the center of the floor. Humanity had no fleet here, no army, no leverage, only words. And on this day, words were not enough. The vote is unanimous, intoned Speaker Orithus, his 4 eyes blinking in slow, deliberate rhythm. Humanity is hereby exiled from council space. You will be relocated to the Veil Nebula, a region deemed uninhabitable by every survey ever conducted. You have 30 days to comply. Ambassador Kale, a junior diplomat seated near the back, watched the human delegation's faces. He expected panic. He expected pleading. Instead, he saw something stranger, a quiet, unreadable calm, as if the humans had already accepted a fate the rest of the galaxy thought was a death sentence. The charges against humanity had been building for a decade. Unauthorized expansion, unsanctioned technological development, an unwillingness to submit to council oversight. But everyone in that chamber knew the truth. Humanity wasn't punished for what it had done. It was punished for what it might become. Humans had only been part of galactic society for 60 years. Yet in that short span they had outbuilt, outthought, and outpaced species that had been spacefaring for millennia. Fear, dressed up as law, had finally caught up with them. The human ambassador, a weatherman named Director Aldrich Voss, rose to speak one final time. He did not argue. He did not beg. He simply said, "You believe you are ending us. You are not. You are simply choosing not to watch what happens next." The council laughed. Some delegates didn't even bother to hide their amusement. The Veil Nebula was infamous. A churning storm of ionized gas, gravitational anomalies, and radiation storms so severe that no probe had ever survived more than a few hours inside it. Sending humanity, there wasn't exile. It was execution with extra steps, a way to remove the inconvenient species without anyone having to admit to genocide. Within 30 days, the human migration fleet, 700 ships carrying 12 million people, along with every scrap of technology, data, and resource they could load, departed council space under armed escort. No farewells were offered. No assistance was given. The council watched the fleet vanish into the churning violet clouds of the Veil and considered the matter closed. Ambassador Kale remembered staring at the viewport long after the ships disappeared, troubled by something he couldn't name. Most of his colleagues celebrated that night. He did not. Inside the Veil, the human fleet found a graveyard of dead stars and a maelstrom of radiation that immediately began failing half their systems. Hull plating buckled under pressure differentials no engineer had modeled. Navigation systems blinked out one by one as the nebula's strange magnetic field scrambled every sensor array. Within the first 72 hours, 3 ships were lost. Commander Helena Vance, then a young engineer barely 30 years old, stood on the bridge of the flagship Meridian and watched the casualty report scroll past. She had lost friends. She had lost mentors. And yet, when the captain ordered an emergency retreat vote, she was a lone voice who said, "If we run, we die slowly out there with nothing. If we stay, we might die fast. But we'll die trying to build something. I'd rather try." The vote passed by a narrow margin. Humanity would stay. What followed was not a story of survival. It was a story of transformation. Engineers studied the nebula's violent energy fields and discovered they could be harnessed, not just endured. Scientists found that the very radiation meant to kill them contained rare isotopes capable of powering reactors far more efficient than anything in council space. The chaos that had been weaponized against them became raw material. Within the first year, the survivors had stabilized 3 derelict asteroid clusters into livable habitats, shielded by improvised radiation barriers built from salvaged hull plating and nebula minerals. Within the first 5 years, those 3 habitats had become 30. Humanity didn't just survive the Veil Nebula. It began to belong there. And as the years passed in total isolation from the rest of the galaxy, something began to grow in the heart of that supposedly lifeless storm. Something the Council, comfortable in its certainty that humanity was already gone, would never see coming. What if the very thing meant to kill you became the foundation of an empire? Deep inside the Veil Nebula, humanity was about to prove that exile and opportunity could be the same word. 17 years is a long time to be forgotten. In council space, humanity became a footnote, then a punchline, then nothing at all. New crises consumed the galaxy's attention. Border disputes, trade wars, the slow political maneuvering of 400 worlds. The species exiled to the Veil Nebula simply ceased to matter to anyone who hadn't gone with them. But inside the Veil, time moved differently. Every year was a war against the environment, and every year, humanity won a little more ground. The first major breakthrough came in year 3, when material scientist Dr. Imani Reyes discovered that the nebula's ionized particles, when filtered through a specific crystalline lattice, could be converted into an almost limitless power source. The discovery, later called Reyes conversion, became the backbone of every habitat, every ship, every piece of technology humanity would go on to build. Where council engineers needed massive fusion reactors and constant fuel shipments, human engineers could now draw power directly from the environment that was supposed to kill them. With power no longer a constraint, the colonies expanded rapidly. Asteroid habitats were hollowed out and pressurized, their interiors transformed into layered cities stacked in concentric rings. Hydroponic farms stretched for kilometers through repurposed mining tunnels, lit by Reyes-powered grow lamps that mimicked the true sun. Children who had been born during the journey into exile grew up never knowing any home but the Veil. To them, this wasn't a prison. It was simply Earth's successor. Commander Vance, now leading the colony's engineering council, pushed for something even more ambitious. Stealth technology that could mask entire fleets within the nebula's natural chaos. If the Veil's radiation and gravitational distortion had once been humanity's greatest enemy, Vance reasoned it could become humanity's greatest shield. Ships designed to blend into ionized storms. Habitats that radiated no detectable signature beyond the nebula's natural noise. An entire civilization, hidden in plain sight, invisible to any sensor array the rest of the galaxy possessed. It took 9 years to perfect. By year 12, humanity could move entire battle groups through the nebula and beyond its borders without a single council sensor station registering their presence. This was when the quiet expansion began. Scout ships, cloaked and silent, slipped past the edges of the Veil to study the broader region of space the Council had long since written off as worthless, a sparse, resource-poor stretch nobody wanted. Humanity claimed it anyway, system by system, building hidden relay stations and automated mining platforms that fed raw materials back into the heart of their growing civilization. No one was there to stop them. No one even knew to look. By year 15, the Human Federation, now numbering nearly 20 million, swelled by population growth and the discovery of cryopreserved colonists kept in reserve since the original migration, possessed a fleet more advanced than anything Council space had ever fielded. Their ships didn't rely on the brute force armor and weapons doctrine that dominated galactic warfare. Instead, they used adaptive shielding drawn from nebula research, weapons that disrupted enemy systems rather than simply destroying hulls, and a stealth doctrine that meant most of their military strength had never been seen by outside eyes. It was around this time that strange anomalies began to appear at the edges of Council territory. Flickers in sensor rays, brief power failures in outposts along forgotten trade routes, automated mining stations that simply stopped responding. Council engineers dismissed them as cosmic background interference or equipment failure. They had no reason to suspect otherwise. Humanity, after all, was dead. Everyone knew that. Everyone except Ambassador Kale. Now a senior intelligence officer attached to the Council's Outer Territory Division, Kale had spent years compiling reports that most of his colleagues ignored. The anomalies weren't random. When he plotted them on a star chart, they formed an unmistakable pattern. A slow, deliberate ring expanding outward from the heart of Veil Nebula, growing wider every year. Something was moving out there. Something organized. Something that didn't want to be found. He brought his findings to the Council Oversight Committee 3 times. 3 times he was dismissed. "The humans are gone, Ambassador," one senior counselor told him, barely looking up from his data slate. "There is nothing alive in that nebula. There never was meant to be." Kale wasn't so sure. And deep inside the Veil, in a command center built from salvaged council hull plating and 17 years of stubborn human ingenuity, Commander Helena Vance stood before a star map of her own, one that showed every step of humanity's silent expansion, every system reclaimed, every piece of the galaxy slowly being mapped, studied, and prepared for what was coming next. "They think we're dead," she said to the officers gathered around her. Let them keep thinking that. A little longer. Behind her, a massive shipyard glowed faintly through a reinforced viewport. Dozens of vessels under construction, sleek and unlike anything Council engineers had ever designed. The flagship taking shape at the center of the yard would one day be named the Resolve, and would carry humanity's answer back to the civilization that had tried to erase them. The countdown to that day had already begun. One officer refused to believe a ghost story. What he discovered would shatter 17 years of comfortable lies and force an entire galaxy to confront a truth it had buried alive. Ambassador Kale's office on the Council's Outer Rim listening station was small, cluttered, and largely ignored by his superiors, which was exactly how he preferred it. For the better part 2 years, he had quietly built a case that no one wanted to hear, cross-referencing sensor logs, trade route disruptions, and abandoned outpost reports that other analysts had filed away as routine malfunctions. The pattern he found was too precise to be coincidence. Each anomaly, when mapped against time and location, traced the edge of an invisible boundary expanding outward from the Veil Nebula at a slow, deliberate rate, almost as if something massive were drawing a circle around Council space without anyone noticing the pen. He requested additional sensor drones be deployed to the affected sectors. The request was denied as a waste of resources. He requested access to historical survey data from the Veil itself, hoping to understand what kind of environment could produce such consistent, organized interference. That request was denied, too, on the grounds that the region was uninhabited and of no strategic interest. So Kale did something he knew could end his career. He filed for an unauthorized reconnaissance mission, using an old decommissioned scout ship, slated for scrap, and flew to the edge of the Veil himself. What he found there defied every briefing he had ever received. From a cautious distance, sensors that should have shown nothing but churning gas and radiation instead caught fleeting, fragmentary readings, gravity wells that didn't match any natural phenomenon, faint energy signatures that flickered in and out like something deliberately concealing itself, and once, for less than 2 seconds, the unmistakable outline of the structure far too symmetrical to be a natural asteroid formation. Kale's hands shook as he recorded the data. He had spent his entire career believing in the Council's version of events, that humanity had perished in the nebula, a tragic but inevitable consequence of their own dangerous ambition. Staring at his readouts, he understood, with sudden and complete certainty, that the Council had not exiled a dying species. They had exiled something that refused to die, and in refusing, it had become something else entirely. He returned to Council space and requested an emergency session with the full oversight committee. This time, his evidence was too specific to dismiss outright. Gravitational anomalies, energy signatures, a structure that should not exist in a region declared lifeless 17 years earlier. The committee listened in uneasy silence as he laid out his findings, the chamber's usual murmurs of dismissal replaced by something closer to dread. "You're telling us," said Counselor Athras, her voice tight, "that the species we exiled to die has been alive this entire time, building, expanding, and we never noticed." "I'm telling you," Kale replied, "that we never wanted to notice. It was easier to believe the problem had solved itself." The committee ordered a full intelligence review, dispatching additional surveillance assets to the Veil's perimeter under strict secrecy, desperate to confirm or deny Kale's findings before any wider panic could spread. For 3 weeks, those assets gathered fragments of data, more anomalies, more flickers of impossible technology, more silence where there should have been nothing at all. Then, on the 22nd day, every sensor in the sector went dark simultaneously. When they came back online 90 seconds later, a single object had appeared at the precise edge of Council territory, hanging motionless in space exactly where the old exile boundary had once been drawn. It was small, barely the size of a transport shuttle, and it was broadcasting on every frequency the Council monitored, an open channel that could not be jammed, blocked, or ignored. The message that followed was recorded, transcribed, and distributed to every government, military command, and media outlet across 400 worlds within hours. It began with a woman's voice, calm and unhurried, speaking as though she had all the time in the galaxy and none of the fear that should have accompanied her words. This is Commander Helena Vance, speaking on behalf of the Free Federation of Humanity. 17 years ago, you exiled 12 million people to a region of space you believed would kill us. You were wrong. We did not merely survive the Veil Nebula. We built something there, a civilization, a fleet, a future you cannot begin to imagine. We are returning to Council space in 7 days. We do not come for revenge, though some among you may deserve it. We come to claim our rightful place among the civilizations of this galaxy and offer every world a choice. Join a new federation built on cooperation and shared progress, or remain as you are, governed by the same fear and short-sightedness that condemned us in the first place. You have 7 days to decide what kind of galaxy you want to live in. We will not ask twice. The transmission ended. The probe that had carried it dissolved into harmless dust, as if it had never been built to survive its delivery in the first place. Across 400 worlds, the reaction was immediate and explosive. Stock markets collapsed. Military commands scrambled fleets to defensive postures. Politicians who had spent careers insisting humanity was a forgotten footnote now faced a galaxy demanding to know how a species declared extinct had returned with a fleet, a federation, and 7 days' notice. In the grand chamber where humanity had once stood condemned and powerless, the council convened an emergency session that would last through the night. For the first time in living memory, no delegate laughed. No delegate dismissed the threat as exaggeration. They had seen the probe. They had heard the voice. And deep in the silence of that chamber, every single one of them understood that the choice Vance had offered was not a courtesy. It was a warning. A countdown had begun, and an entire galaxy had to decide whether to fight a war it couldn't win, or face a truth it had spent 17 years refusing to accept. Panic does strange things to a civilization built on centuries of certainty. For 400 worlds that had long considered themselves the unquestioned masters of the galaxy, the 7-8 countdown broadcast by Commander Vance triggered a response that was equal parts denial, fury, and barely concealed terror. The Council's military command, led by the aging but formidable Fleet Admiral Threxus, wasted no time. Within hours of the transmission, mobilization orders went out to every shipyard and naval base within reach. Admiral Threxus had spent his career building the Council's deterrent fleet. 3,000 warships representing combined military might of every member species, designed to crush any single threat through sheer overwhelming numbers. They are 17 years removed from our technology. Threxus told the Emergency War Council, his confidence sounding thinner with each repetition. Whatever they have built, it cannot match a fleet of this size. We will meet them at the boundary, demonstrate our strength, and force them to negotiate from a position of weakness, not strength. Not everyone agreed. Ambassador Kale, now an uneasy fixture in every closed-door briefing, argued for caution. You didn't see what I saw at the edge of that nebula, he warned. Whatever they built in 17 years of isolation, it wasn't built to lose. We need to consider what happens if a fleet that size is enough. His warnings were noted and largely ignored. 3,000 warships represented more firepower than had ever been assembled in galactic history. Surely it would be enough to make any newly formed federation think twice. Across the Council's territories, civilian reactions split along familiar lines. Some worlds, remembering the original injustice of humanity's exile, quietly hoped the Council would finally be humbled. Others, gripped by fear of an unknown enemy with unknown capabilities, demanded immediate and overwhelming military action. Media channels filled with speculation, conspiracy theories, and increasingly desperate analysis from experts who had spent careers studying a species they'd assumed was already extinct. Inside the Veil Nebula, the mood could not have been more different. Commander Vance walked the corridors of the flagship Resolve in the final days before departure, watching as engineers made last adjustments to systems that had been 17 years in the making. There was no panic here, no last-minute scramble. Only quiet, practiced readiness, the product of nearly 2 decades spent preparing for exactly this moment. Did you think they'll fight? asked Lieutenant Commander Tobias Reyes, son of the scientist whose discovery had powered humanity's entire resurgence, now serving as Vance's tactical officer. "I think they'll try," Vance said. "Fear makes people do things that logic tells them not to. But I'd rather they understand what we are before any shots are fired. That's why we're giving them 7 days instead of 7 minutes." The human fleet that departed the Veil Nebula on the appointed day numbered only 200 ships, a fraction of the Council's mobilized force. But every vessel had been designed and built using technology refined over 17 years of uninterrupted innovation, adaptive shielding capable of redirecting incoming fire, weapon systems that disabled rather than destroyed, and a stealth doctrine so advanced that the Council's sensor net, for all its mobilized strength, would not register the fleet's true numbers or positions until humanity chose to be seen. As the human fleet crossed the boundary into Council space, Admiral Threxus's combined armada moved to intercept, forming a defensive wall meant to project unbreakable strength. 3,000 warships, bristling with weapons, arrayed against 200 vessels that should, by every conventional measure, have been hopelessly outmatched. For a tense, breathless moment, it seemed as though the galaxy's worst fears might be realized, that this would end not in negotiation, but in the first shots of a war no one could predict the outcome of. Then the human fleet did something no one in the Council command expected. They did not advance. They did not retreat. They simply stopped, hanging in space at a respectful but unmistakable distance from the Council's assembled might, weapons power but not raised, formations defensive but not aggressive. A single transmission opened across every channel, every frequency, every screen in the Council's command structure simultaneously. The same calm, unhurried voice that had delivered the original warning 7 days earlier. "We are not here to start a war," Commander Vance said. "We are here to end one that began 17 years ago, when you decided our survival was a problem rather than a possibility. You have shown us your strength. Now we would like to show you ours, not as a threat, but as proof that this can end without a single life lost on either side, if you are willing to listen." Admiral Threxus, staring at his tactical display, felt something cold settle in his chest. His sensors, the most advanced military technology the Council possessed, were only now beginning to register the true scope of the human fleet's capabilities. Shield strengths that defied known physics, weapon signatures unlike anything in the Council's databases, and worse, the unmistakable sense that what he was seeing represented only a fraction of what humanity actually possessed. For the first time in his long military career, Admiral Threxus hesitated, and in that hesitation, the entire galaxy held its breath, waiting to see whether 17 years of quiet, determined transformation would end in cooperation or catastrophe. 3,000 warships stood ready to fight. 200 stood ready to forgive. What happened next would decide whether the galaxy's oldest civilizations could survive their own pride. The silence that followed Commander Vance's transmission stretched long enough that several junior officers aboard the Council flagship began quietly preparing emergency contingencies, certain that combat was only moments away. Admiral Threxus remained motionless at his command station, weighing a decision that would define not just his career, but quite possibly the survival of everyone under his command. His tactical advisors were split. Half urged an immediate demonstration of force, a warning shot, a show of resolve. Anything to avoid appearing weak in front of the species they had spent 17 years dismissing as extinct. The other half, increasingly alarmed by the sensor readings still streaming in from the human fleet, argued that any aggressive action risked a confrontation the Council could not win, regardless of numbers. It was Ambassador Kale, watching the standoff from a secure communications channel, who finally broke the deadlock, not through military authority, which he didn't possess, but through requests relayed directly to Admiral Threxus. "Let them demonstrate," Kale urged. "If Commander Vance wanted this fleet destroyed, she would have done it already. She's offering proof instead of an ultimatum. We should at least see what that proof looks like before we decide it's a trick." Reluctantly, Threxus authorized a single, narrow communication window, granting the human fleet permission to demonstrate whatever capability they intended to show, under the explicit condition that any aggressive move will be met with full retaliatory force. What followed was not an attack. A single human vessel, no larger than a Council corvette, detached from the main fleet and approached an empty stretch of space roughly equidistant between the two forces. Without firing a single weapon, the ship activated a system that Council sensors struggled to even categorize, a localized field that began stabilizing a dangerously unstable pocket of subspace turbulence that had plagued that exact sector of space for decades, a known hazard that had cost the Council numerous ships and crews over the years. Within minutes, the turbulence that Council engineers had spent generations failing to solve was simply, quietly resolved. It was a small thing in the grand scope of a galaxy-spanning standoff, but its message was unmistakable. Humanity hadn't returned merely to demonstrate weapons capable of destruction. They had returned with the ability to fix problems the Council itself had never managed to solve. Commander Vance's voice returned to every channel. That hazard has existed in this sector for 31 years, according to your own historical records. We could have weaponized what we've built in the Veil Nebula. Instead, we chose to spend the last 7 days preparing solutions, not just warnings. This is what we're offering the galaxy. Not domination, but partnership built on what we've learned surviving someone you believed was impossible to survive. The shift in mood across the Council command was immediate and palpable. Officers who had braced for war found themselves staring at proof of a civilization that had clearly chosen restraint over revenge, despite possessing every capability needed to make revenge devastatingly easy. Admiral Threxus, after a long, silent consultation with his command staff, made a decision that would ultimately define the rest of his career. He ordered the Council fleet to stand down, weapons powered off, formations relaxed from their defensive posture. It was not surrender in the traditional sense. No terms had been forced, no battle had been fought, but it was unmistakably an acknowledgement that the galaxy's old order had just encountered something it could not simply overpower. Negotiations began within hours, conducted not in the grand, ceremonial halls of the Council chamber, but aboard the Resolve itself, where Commander Vance personally hosted representatives from every major Council world willing to attend. Ambassador Kale, whose years of dismissed warnings had finally been vindicated, was given a seat at the table, not as a conqueror's guest, but as the one person in the room who had understood what was coming before anyone else. "You could have destroyed us," Counselor Athras said quietly, studying Vance across the negotiation table. "Your fleet alone proved that. Why didn't you?" Vance considered the question carefully before answering. "Because the people who exiled us made a choice rooted in fear. Fear of what we might become. Fear of losing control over a galaxy they thought belonged only to them. If we answered that fear with violence, we'd simply be proving they were right to be afraid. We'd rather prove them wrong." Over the following days, the framework for what would eventually become the new Galactic Federation began to take shape, not as a conquest, but as an invitation. Worlds that had once voted unanimously for humanity's exile were offered access to technology that could solve generations-old infrastructure problems, cure diseases that had resisted treatment for centuries, and stabilize environmental crises that threatened entire populations. In exchange, humanity asked only for recognition as equal partners in a galaxy they had once been told they didn't deserve to be part of at all. Not every world agreed immediately. Some delegates resisted, clinging to old hierarchies and old fears, unwilling to accept that the species they cast out had returned not as victims seeking revenge, but as architect of a future they could no longer ignore. But one by one, as the practical benefits of partnership became undeniable, and as humanity continued to demonstrate restraint, generosity, and genuine cooperation rather than domination, resistance began to soften. The Council that had once unanimously condemned humanity to a slow, forgotten death in the Veil Nebula now found itself, just 7 days after a single warning transmission, negotiating the terms of its own transformation into something new. This is how an exile becomes an empire, and how an empire becomes a home for everyone, even the ones who once tried to destroy it. The final chapter of humanity's return is also the beginning of everything that came after. 50 years is long enough to forget a war. It is long enough, too, to build something that no one believed possible in its place. The grand chamber where humanity had once stood condemned, alone and powerless, now bore little resemblance to the room Ambassador Kale remembered from his early career. The old Council seal, once representing the unchallenged authority of 400 worlds acting through fear and self-interest, had been replaced decades earlier by the emblem of the new Galactic Federation, a design that deliberately incorporated symbols from every founding member species, humanity included, none placed above the others. Kale, now well into his final years of service, often found himself reflecting on the strange path that had brought the galaxy to this point. He had spent the early part of his career compiling evidence that everyone around him refused to believe, certain that humanity's exile had been a tragedy quietly buried and forgotten. He had spent the later part of his career watching that same exiled species rebuild not just itself, but eventually the very civilization that had cast it out. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, nor had it happened without difficulty. The first decade of the Federation's existence had been marked by cautious cooperation, old suspicions slowly giving way as humanity consistently demonstrated that its offer of partnership had never been a trick or a temporary gesture. Human engineers, drawing on technology refined over 17 years of isolated innovation, helped stabilize failing ecosystems on worlds that had spent generations battling slow environmental collapse. Human medical researchers, working alongside scientists from a dozen other species, developed treatments for diseases that had resisted every previous attempt at a cure. Infrastructure projects that Council worlds had abandoned as too costly or too difficult were quietly completed, often at humanity's expense, with no demand for repayment beyond continued partnership. Commander Helena Vance, who had led the fleet that returned to Council space with nothing but 200 ships and an offer peace, had gone on to become the first Federation Chancellor, a position she held for nearly 2 decades before stepping aside to make room for new leadership drawn from across the Federation's growing membership. By the time she retired from public life, the institution she had helped build no longer needed her constant presence to function. It had become something larger than any single leader, exactly as she had always hoped it would. The Veil Nebula itself, once considered a death sentence by every species in the galaxy, had become something else entirely. A living monument to what humanity had built there, and a popular destination for scholars, engineers, and curious travelers eager to study the technology and resilience that had emerged from 17 years of impossible survival. The original asteroid habitats, expanded and modernized over decades, still stood at the heart of human territory, a permanent reminder of how far the species had come from the day it was unanimously condemned to die there. Not every old wound had fully healed. Some worlds, even 50 years later, carried lingering resentment over the role they had played in humanity's original exile, while others quietly took pride in having been among the first to extend a hand of partnership once the truth became undeniable. But the Federation that had grown from those uneasy beginnings had become, by nearly every measure, more stable, more prosperous, and more genuinely cooperative than the Council had replaced ever managed to be. On the anniversary of the original transmission, the message that had once thrown the entire galaxy into panic, representatives from every Federation world gathered in the very chamber where humanity had once been condemned, now to celebrate 50 years of partnership, instead of mourning what many had assumed would be humanity's quiet extinction. Ambassador Kale, invited to speak as one of the few people who had witnessed the entire transformation firsthand, stood before the assembled delegates and offered words he had been carrying with him for half a century. "We once believed strength meant the ability to conquer," he said, his voice carrying through a chamber that had finally, after so many years, learned to listen rather than dismiss. Humanity taught us something different. They taught us that real strength is the ability to survive rejection, to turn exile into opportunity, and then, when given every reason to seek revenge, to choose generosity instead. We did not save them 50 years ago. They saved us from becoming the kind of galaxy that destroys what it doesn't understand. Far beyond the chamber, in the depth of the Veil Nebula where it had all begun, new generations of humans grew up knowing the story not as a tale of survival, but as a founding myth of an entire era, proof that even total rejection from everyone they had ever known could become the foundation for something greater than anyone, including humanity itself, had ever imagined possible. The galaxy had not fallen to humanity, exactly as Commander Vance had always intended. It had simply, in the end, chosen to stand beside it,